The subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitations in the rules. I'll go ahead and make an opening statement and then turn it over to the ranking member of the Asia, Pacific, and Non-Proliferation Subcommittee, Mr. Yoho, for his opening statement. And then we will go to the chairman and ranking member of the Middle East, North Africa, and International Terrorism Subcommittee, Mr. Deutsch and Mr. Wilson, for their opening statements. I want to thank the ranking member, Mr. Yoho, Mr. Deutsch, and Mr. Wilson, members of the subcommittee and our witnesses for joining us today. Roughly 75 years ago, we saw the devastation of atomic weapons, decimating Hiroshima and Nagasaki, thousands of deaths instantaneously and unimaginable suffering for years afterwards. That marked the beginning of the nuclear age. And if we think about the weapons that came after that, these weapons were many times more powerful than what we saw in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In 1963, President Kennedy warned that by the 1970s, we could see 15 to 20, 25 nuclear-armed nations. As a child, I think many of us remember the duck and cover drills that we used to do in schools. It was a dangerous time. That said, this spurned 50 years ago the negotiation of the landmark Treaty on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the NPT. This week marks 50 years of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. 50 years after the NPT, where President Kennedy predicted potentially 25 nuclear-armed states, there are less than 10 nuclear weapon possessor states in the world. Over 190 states are parties to the treaty. Only one country so far has broken out of the treaty after ratifying it, North Korea. The international community, led by the United States, has weaved together a complex network of non-proliferation norms, safeguards, and export controls, all designed to keep Americans and the world safer and limit dangerous technology. Every 5 years, the NPT is discussed at a treaty review conference of NPT member states in New York City. This year, this conference will happen in late April with the U.S. delegation led by Ambassador Jeff Eberhardt, who I had the pleasure of meeting last week. While the NPT has largely been a success and greatly contributed to U.S. security, there are challenges that should be addressed. I imagine and hope they will be addressed at the upcoming review conference. If you think about the basic pillars of the NPT, they really are three. Non-proliferation, the second being peaceful uses of nuclear technology, and the third being disarmament. If we think about non-proliferation, Iran is, for now, a part of the NPT. The JCPOA was layered on top of the NPT to constrain Iran. Those constraints are now disappearing after the administration's withdrawal from the agreement. The Trump administration currently has no alternative plan in place to replace the JCPOA, but fortunately, at a minimum, Iran's NPT commitments remain intact, although we are hearing reports now that they may not be in full compliance, and I think we will get into that later on in the hearing. So how do we use the NPT or other non-proliferation tools to ensure Iran remains free of nuclear weapons? North Korea is another non-proliferation challenge. North Korea withdrew from the NPT years ago. Today, negotiations between the United States and North Korea appear to have stalled. Is there a way to use the NPT or the NPT Review Conference to restart diplomatic momentum with North Korea directly or with our allies on the North Korean challenge? The second pillar of the NPT is responsible, peaceful use of nuclear technology. Congress has debated whether nuclear technology should be sold to countries like Saudi Arabia. The Saudis, we know, have made veiled threats at obtaining nuclear weapons. The debate over the rights of countries to have enrichment and reprocessing capabilities is not new. The nuclear energy industry is still very active. The world is safer when states that do not need dual-use technologies do not have them. The NPT provides us with guidelines and norms for responsible, peaceful use of nuclear technology. As technology advances, we can and should push these norms to encourage tighter restrictions with the dangerous capabilities of enrichment and reprocessing. Similarly, it's important to discuss the additional protocol. This is the protocol that states that states ratify to supplement their existing safeguard agreements with the IAEA. It's not impossible for countries to covertly develop dangerous technologies, even with standard IAEA safeguard agreements. With the additional protocol in place, the IAEA has stronger inspections access than they would be authorized to have otherwise. The United States has encouraged universalization of the additional protocol and should continue to do so, especially as it considers transferring nuclear technology to states like Saudi Arabia. The last leg of the NPT is disarmament obligations and challenges. As part of our obligation to the NPT and the promise we made to non-nuclear weapon states, the United States and others promised to take good faith measures towards ending the arms race and towards disarmament. However, we've seen the Trump administration, they've withdrawn from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF, without an alternative. They've rejected seeking ratification of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, the CTBT, and currently they're raising serious questions on whether we will extend the U.S.-Russia New START agreement. Our commitment to this obligation to the NPT and other non-nuclear weapon states has been called into question. I understand the administration's desire to get China included in an arms control treaty before extending New START. However, I think arms control with China is good, but extending the New START provides more time and stronger foundation to deal with China while constraining Russia. If we fail to extend New START and have no alternatives in place, is the United States also failing to fill our NPT obligations? I hope the international community can come together and agree on several forward-looking steps for strengthening the NPT. These are many questions to consider. I'm looking forward to hearing from our experts today to provide us with their insights and advice on where the United States should go from here. And with that, I turn it over to the ranking member, Mr. Yoho, for purposes of his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do look forward to this meeting, this hearing today, and I appreciate you all being here. Good morning, Chairman Bear, for holding this hearing, analyzing international progress on nuclear non-proliferation in light of the 50th anniversary of the NPT Treaty and the upcoming 2020 NPT Review Conference. I'd like to thank our witnesses for joining us today. I look forward to hearing from each of you regarding the significance of NPT negotiations and how we can better position the international community to take action on rogue nuclear states. The NPT recognizes a global commitment to three principles of non-nuclear proliferation, disarmament, and preventing the creation of new nuclear weapons beyond Russia, the U.S., United Kingdom, France, and China. Today, we have two nations that present a direct challenge to these values in Iran and North Korea. As the only state to ever withdraw from the NPT, North Korea presents a real danger to the international community as a provocative nuclear power. Years of spurned cooperation and failed IAEA inspections have contributed to an unacceptable situation where an authoritarian state maintains nuclear weapon stockpiles capable of targeting hundreds of millions of people. Just days ago, North Korea fired 2 ballistic missiles into the Sea of Japan in their first weapons test of the year. Moreover, the threats posed by an unstable North Korea state directly endangers our allies in the Asia-Pacific region, including South Korea, Japan, and others. Moving forward, it is imperative that we purpose NPT discussions with our regional partners to ensure the containment of a nuclear North Korea and prevent the further sophistication of their missile development program. Iran presents a different dilemma for the United States as a leading state sponsor of terror. While Iran has yet to obtain a nuclear weapon, its stated interest in developing its nuclear program beyond the means needed to produce energy should prompt concerns among policymakers here in Washington, along with our allies in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. President Eisenhower talked about this. The only reason to have a covert nuclear program is to have weapons of mass destruction. If it's a peaceful program, it'll be out in the open, and that's something that we haven't seen with Iran, and I think that's something disconcerting should be to the whole world. Earlier this year, Iran officially announced that they would no longer limit themselves to the limits set by the JCPOA enriching uranium beyond 3.67. I think the reports we heard now, it's roughly 4.3%. Purity limit, and spinning up previously empty centrifuges. This news came just after reports surfaced that Iran has now developed nuclear-capable ballistic missiles. Iran is notorious for proliferating weapons of war throughout the Middle East to terror organizations. Comrades in the Revolutionary Guards are directly responsible for the deaths of hundreds of Americans in the Middle East, along with thousands of Muslims. Given the supposed restraint shown by Iran so far, I ask my colleagues on this committee to imagine what kind of state Iran would be as a nuclear power. The NPT Review Conference presents our country and our allies with another opportunity to secure contentious regions abroad from repeated bad actors. Specifically, the U.S. should urge NPT signatories to join together in calling for further investigations into Iran's compliance with NPT agreement and to urge Iran to allow IAEA inspectors into their country unimpeded. If Iran truly seeks to only harness nuclear material from energy purposes, they should have nothing to hide, as President Eisenhower said. Further, the U.S. should continue to call for North Korea to return to the NPT negotiation and halt the development of its nuclear program. I look forward to the hearing from our witnesses and how we can achieve these goals, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Yoho. And now we turn to the Chair of the Middle East, North Africa, and International Terrorism Subcommittee, Chairman Deutsch.
Thank you, Thank you, Chairman Barra, for convening this joint hearing. Thanks to the witnesses for testifying this morning. Our purpose today is to examine the status of the Non-Proliferation Treaty as we commemorate its 50th anniversary. As we seek to strengthen the NPT and reinforce broader non-proliferation norms, Congress must understand how to protect the treaty from two immediate looming challenges, Iran and North Korea. North Korea is the only state to have withdrawn from the NPT. It joined the treaty as a non-nuclear weapon state in 1985, but formally withdrew from the NPT in January of 2003. North Korea is known to have conducted 6 underground nuclear tests since October 2006 and is believed to possess dozens of nuclear weapons. The United States must work with our allies, our partners, and the broader international community to ensure that Iran does not go down the same path by withdrawing from the NPT and then expanding its nuclear program. Iran remains a party to the NPT as a non-nuclear weapon state and has a comprehensive IAEA safeguards agreement which requires Tehran to declare and submit all of its nuclear materials to regular IAEA inspections in order to prevent their diversion to military use. As part of the safeguards agreement, the IAEA may also inspect other facilities if it suspects that undeclared nuclear materials or weapons-related activities are present. Taken together, these mechanisms contain and promote oversight of Iran's nuclear program. Tehran has threatened several times to withdraw from the NPT, but has not followed through. In January, after the United Kingdom, France, and Germany invoked the dispute mechanism in the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, Iran again threatened to withdraw from the NPT if the issue reaches the Security Council. The IAEA's quarterly report on Iran will be released today, and for the first time since implementation of the JCPOA, the IAEA will publish a second complementary report criticizing Tehran for its lack of cooperation with international inspectors. The report will also raise safeguards issues by noting that Iran has failed to provide the IAEA access to at least one nuclear site of interest. The quarterly report is also expected to show that Iran is enriching uranium and maintaining a stockpile of enriched uranium at levels higher than permitted by the JCPOA. These developments are concerning, and Iranian withdrawal from the NPT would be a significant setback for the United States and the broader non-proliferation regime. Iran's expansion of its nuclear program past limits dictated by the JCPOA also reduces the time needed for it to break out to a nuclear weapons capability if it chooses. I'm also troubled by the Trump administration's withdrawal from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty without an alternative to constrain Russian missiles. Furthermore, rather than extending the New START Treaty, which continued a process started by President Reagan and President Bush of verifiably limiting Moscow's strategic nuclear arsenal, The Trump administration is seeking to replace it with a new trilateral treaty between the United States, Russia, and China. And while this is a worthy long-term goal, we should extend New START, which is working, before tackling a more difficult trilateral agreement with Beijing. The termination of New START would loosen restraints on Russia and would undermine the strategic stability that has advanced world peace since the early 1970s. These non-proliferation and arms control treaties are a bedrock of the U.S.-led international order, and I hope the witnesses today will explain how we can strengthen them and reinforce the non-proliferation norms that promote U.S. security and stabilize the international system. So I thank the witnesses again for being here today, and I thank you, Chairman Bera, for leading this important hearing. Now you back.
Thank you, Mr. Deutsch. Finally, for opening remarks, the ranking member of the Middle East Subcommittee, Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Chairman Ted Deutsch and Chairman Ami Bera and Ranking Member Dr. Ted Yoho for calling this hearing on Iranian and North Korean challenges to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT. And thank each of the witnesses for being here today. As already mentioned, this hearing is especially timely as we approach the 50th anniversary of the NPT on March 5th, as well as the upcoming 2020 NPT Review Conference beginning in late April. It's without question that the NPT went into effect in 1970. It marked a major victory for the cause of nonproliferation and arms control. It set an important precedent for international cooperation between nuclear and non-nuclear states to prevent proliferation. 50 years after its entering into force, it remains an important achievement and safeguard against the spread of nuclear weapons. While many have heralded the NPT's important achievements, we would be wise to consider some of the significant flaws as we approach the 2020 NPT Review Conference. The flaws inherent in the NPT are part and parcel of the weakness of the international system. Too often we see rogue states exploit the rules and norms of the international system in order to achieve their own nefarious goals. We have seen this at multinational institutions where, for example, human rights violators like Venezuela, Cuba, and Iran use their seats on the Human Rights Council to whitewash their crimes, or when the Assad regime exploits the United Nations aid in order to underwrite its genocidal campaign against the Syrian people. The NPT is no exception here. Unfortunately, the NPT can provide those countries intent on developing nuclear weapons with a wonderful cover. The treaty not only permits, actually encourages non-nuclear weapon states to develop nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, but the technology for producing nuclear fuel is the same as the technology for producing weapons-grade uranium, providing bad actors with an important piece of the nuclear weapons puzzle. No one doubts the benefits derived from the NPT. The problem is that one rotten apple or two can spoil the bunch. There is a real danger that rogue regimes can exploit this treaty for their own malign and covert ends. This is what Iran's mullahs have done for years, claiming they were working on peaceful nuclear technology while they were effectively hurtling toward nuclear weapons breakout capability. The NPT lacks any enforcement mechanism, and a country can decide to withdraw at any time by invoking Article 10. Article 10 effectively gives enormous leverage to those countries seeking to threaten international security. When a country announces intent to leave the NPT, the international community quickly does everything it can to prevent a withdrawal. That's exactly what happened in 1994 when North Korea announced it was leaving the NPT, and Washington and Pyongyang quickly signed the agreed framework. It happened again in 2003 when the six-party talks were initiated, and as we now know, both of these diplomatic initiatives were failures. North Korea was intent on developing nuclear weapons. As one of the two members of Congress who have actually been to Pyongyang, I've seen their sad existence. The North Korean case has served as a model for the mullahs in Tehran. They learned that through threatening to leave the NPT, they can hold the international community hostage and extract important concessions. The Iranians have also learned that the violations or abrogation of the NPT come with absolutely no penalties. That's why we're seeing the Iranian dictatorship today use the NPT to have leverage in negotiations with Europe over the JCPOA. Iran is threatening to leave the NPT on top of violating this JCPOA as their intent on death to Israel, death to America. The international community must wake up to the realization that Iran has been using the JCPOA in much the same way North Korea has used the NPT as a means to reach its ultimate goal of nuclear weapons at the cheapest diplomatic and military cost. Arms control agreements have become the bedrock of international security, but when they're exploited by rogue regimes, they have the potential to complicate non-proliferation initiatives and provide a clandestine pathway to a bomb. I look forward to hearing how we can endeavor to strengthen NPT specifically and the international non-proliferation regime more broadly. Thank you for being here today, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. I'm very pleased to welcome our witnesses to today's hearing. We are joined by 4 expert witnesses in defense and multilateral affairs. Dr. Wendon Smith, the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction. She will be followed by former Coordinator for Threat Reduction Programs, Bureau of International Security and Nonproliferation, Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins. The next state witness will be Mr. Richard C. Johnson, former Director of Nonproliferation from the National Security Council. And finally, we're honored to be joined by the Honorable Stephen G. Rademacher, former Assistant Secretary of State, Bureau of Arms Control and International Security and Nonproliferation for the State Department. Please summarize your written statements to 5 minutes, and without objection, your prepared written remarks will be made part of the record. Dr. Smith, if you could begin.
Thank you. Chairman Deutsch, Chairman Bera, Ranking Members Wilson and Yoho, and members of the committee, thank you for holding this hearing. Are you closer? I'm honored to join you and my fellow witnesses and look forward to a dynamic discussion. First, a disclaimer that I am not speaking on behalf of the Department of Defense or any other entity, and these are my personal remarks. Across my career, I have been privileged to serve in government and in industry, including with significant time overseas. As a result, I've gained a deep appreciation for the importance of leveraging the full spectrum of our countering weapons of mass destruction, or CWMD, capabilities that the United States and its allies and partners can bring to bear against these current and evolving threats. I'd like to highlight 3 themes that are reflected in greater detail in my written statement. The first is that non-proliferation, including tools like the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Proliferation Security Initiative, and others, represents just one of many tools in our counter-WMD tool belt. These effectively counter WMD ideation, acquisition, use, threatened use, and delivery. Second, to successfully apply and measure the effectiveness of any of these tools, and to plan for recovery and resilience, we must strengthen and apply an entire enterprise-wide approach. And third, our CWMD tools, whether multilateral or bilateral, or developed within the government or externally, must evolve. To frame the discussion, I offer 3 contextual points. First, countering weapons of mass destruction spans the entire government, from understanding and assessing the intent of a state or non-state actor to effectively fighting through a contaminated environment that might have chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear materials. We must also be prepared to respond and recover. And second, again in framing, a WMD attack, and particularly a nuclear one, has long been considered to be of high impact and low probability. However, events of even the past few years demonstrate that state and non-state actors will continue to use WMD. And finally, we face a complex set of attack surfaces, from conventional to nuclear, space, cyber, information operations, and beyond. To spur the discussion and I think address some of the comments you all have raised, I offer a few challenges for us to consider. First, how we leverage the differing attributes of these CWMD tools and with what sequencing of those tools. Second, who our partners are. The role of industry, academia, think tanks, and other non-traditional partners cannot be underrated and must evolve. Third, how the evolution of counter-WMD tools impacts our extended deterrence, which must remain tailored and steadfast. Fourth, how building partner capacity programs must continue to evolve in today's security environment and to augment these other tools. And fifth, how the emergence or convergence of technology will impact our security in terms of both promise and peril. So to conclude, I would suggest that countering the acquisition, use, or threat of use of weapons of mass destruction remains squarely in the interest of the United States and of our allies and partners. We must support the sustenance and evolution of these tools. In my experience, partnerships and engagements connote communication. The absence of communication, even when fraught, can degrade the security environment. Thank you again for the opportunity to support this discussion, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. Ambassador Jenkins.
Good morning, Chairman Bera, Chairman Deutsch, Ranking Member Yoho, and Ranking Member Wilson. Thank you for holding this hearing, and I'm honored to be here. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is a central part of a global non-proliferation regime. As we examine how we strengthen this treaty leading up to the 2020 Review Conference, we cannot divorce those questions from U.S. actions on the overall nuclear non-proliferation structure. The non-proliferation regime has as its foundation the NPT. However, the regime consists of a body of other related treaties and non-binding agreements. This interlocking framework of agreements is under increasing stress and strain. And some of the reasons have been already mentioned today, such as withdrawal from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, failure to pursue diplomatic options to bring Russia back into compliance with the 1987 INF Treaty. The future of the U.S.-Russian New Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty is in question because it expires in 2021, and the fact that the U.S. has not ratified the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Some of these U.S. actions have violated the spirit, if not the letter, of the U.S. obligations under Article 6 of the NPT to pursue negotiations on a treaty on general and complete disarmament. Taken together, these developments put U.S. diplomats in a problematic position as we approach the NPT Review Conference, and how we address issues of Iran and North Korea must be looked within this larger framework. In the lead-up to the JCPOA, there were numerous discussions and disagreements about the intention of Iran's nuclear efforts dating back at least to 2003. Disagreements and the following years finally gave way to negotiations among the P5+1 and Iran that led to the JCPOA. Fundamentally, the agreement successfully limited Iran's nuclear capacity in exchange for nuclear-related sanctions relief. The U.S. withdrew from the JCPOA in 2018, despite Iran's continued compliance with the deal, and later reimposed nuclear-related sanctions. Iran responded with phased reductions in its compliance with the JCPOA throughout 2019 and 2020. It began in 2019 with a series of steps away from the 2015 nuclear deal by exceeding limits on the stockpiles of low-enriched uranium. A general consistent theme, even considering Iran's recent actions that step away from this agreement, is its willingness to remain within the JCPOA. When the U.S. withdrew from the agreement, Iran expressed a desire to stay in the JCPOA despite U.S. withdrawal, as did the other parties. Iran indicated it would not seek additional steps if sanctions were relieved. When in January 2020, Iran announced it would no longer be bound by the JCPOA's limit on centrifuges to enrich uranium, Tehran also emphasized that all its actions were reversible and that it would return to the deal, the sanctions would be lifted, and its interests could be guaranteed. The Iran move in 2020 January led to Britain, France, and Germany meeting to find a way to persuade Iran to abide by the agreement. They spelled out steps in response to Iran's actions, one of them being notifying the UN Security Council, at which time sanctions would be applied. Iran said it would withdraw from the NPT if the case was referred to the UN Security Council. To have a successful review conference, which would also mean addressing the proliferation situation with Iran, the U.S. should be willing to take steps to get the JCPOA back on track and avoid another country from withdrawing from the NPT. In my remarks, I outlined some steps the U.S. can take to address the Iran impasse and promote the non-proliferation regime. Briefly on to North Korea. We know North Korea signed and ratified the NPT, but in 2003 it declared withdrawal. Depending on the source, it's believed that North Korea has 30 nuclear weapons. The possession of these weapons is a challenge to the non-proliferation regime, but that alone is not enough to destroy it. The threat is more in line with the concern of the weapons in North Korea raises in South Korea, as well as in other neighboring countries, and the historical dynamics of those relationships. Our goal should be not only to promote disarmament, but to bring North Korea back into the non-proliferation regime itself. We know the story. After several months of harsh rhetoric between President Trump and Kim Jong-un, there was a series of exchanges between the leaders and 2 summits, one of which failed. Since the failed summit, and despite a visit by President Trump to North Korea, progress has slowed significantly. In fact, in January 2020, North Korea said it felt deceived by the U.S. and would be ending its openness to discussions. North Korea continues to possess nuclear weapons, and the threat it poses to countries in the region remains a challenge to the non-proliferation regime. North Korean possession of nuclear weapons and a failed attempt to convince North Korea to disarm casts a shadow on any possible success of the NPT Review Conference and to the non-proliferation regime itself. In my written remarks, I have outlined steps the U.S. can take to address the North Korean impasse and promote the non-proliferation regime. Global support for the NPT is strong, but its long-term viability cannot be taken for granted. The current challenges facing the NPT require renewed U.S. diplomatic leadership to support all the key pillars of the treaty and the regime, particularly on disarmament and non-proliferation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Jenkins. Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Chairman Barrett, Chairman Deutsch, Ranking Member Yoho, Ranking Member Wilson. Thank you for inviting me to testify this morning, and I will give a short summary of my written testimony, which I've submitted for the record. I'd like to make 3 main points. First, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the cornerstone of the nuclear non-proliferation regime, is under strain due to growing frustration on the part of the non-nuclear weapon states about the perceived slow pace of nuclear disarmament. Second, while the NPT has been largely successful over the past 50 years in preventing proliferation, the distinct cases of North Korea and Iran are clear exceptions that provide lessons for how to strengthen the treaty's implementation by enhancing the international nuclear safeguard system, effectively using tools like sanctions and export controls, and encouraging the peaceful uses of nuclear energy while preventing military uses. And third, universal adherence to the NPT remains the fundamental goal, but we must also prepare for the worst-case scenario and prevent states from abusing the withdrawal provisions of the treaty. Let me now elaborate on these 3 points. First, the NPT has proven to be a durable legal foundation for the global nuclear non-proliferation regime, and we must preserve and strengthen it. Today, though, many non-nuclear weapon states increasingly question whether the 5 recognized nuclear weapon states are committed to upholding their end of the NPT bargain. The nuclear weapon states, led by the United States and Russia, must demonstrate a good faith commitment to progress on disarmament. A necessary first step in this regard is for the United States and Russia to agree to extend the New START Treaty. The United States and Russia, and eventually other states, including China, should also commit to beginning discussions urgently on further steps to reduce nuclear risks, including further reductions in nuclear arsenals. Second, what have we learned from our experience with the North Koreans and the Iranians? The North Korean case is a cautionary tale that it is far preferable to prevent a state from acquiring nuclear weapons than to try to roll back a fully developed nuclear weapons program. This lesson was applied in the case of Iran, which, unlike North Korea, does not have a nuclear weapon. This is because the international community came together on the basis of the NPT, using economic sanctions and diplomatic engagement to address Tehran's undeclared nuclear activities, its nascent nuclear weapons program, and its lack of cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA. The IAEA safeguard system remains essential to preventing proliferation, but more can be done to strengthen it. A key goal is to encourage all NPT parties, especially in the Middle East and North Africa, to adopt the IAEA's additional protocol, which has become the new standard for monitoring and verifying the absence of undeclared nuclear activities in a state. The Iran nuclear deal incorporated innovative detection and monitoring procedures that should be considered for broader application. The IAEA should also continue to develop advanced technologies in sampling and data analysis to increase detection levels. Export controls are a critical element in preventing the diversion of dual-use equipment or technologies to non-peaceful activities. Key states, including China, should work to strengthen export control enforcement. Future UN sanctions regimes should follow the model established of getting panels of experts set up to improve enforcement of sanctions. Encouraging innovative forms of peaceful nuclear cooperation can also bolster the treaty. The Nunn-Lugar model of cooperative threat reduction, or CTR, which was central to helping the states of the former Soviet Union eliminate and reduce weapons of mass destruction, could be repurposed for use in North Korea. Such a program could incentivize North Korea to take nuclear dismantlement steps in return for technical and economic assistance on denuclearization. The involvement of multiple countries in a CTR effort would enhance the sustainability of a denuclearization process. Third, and finally, the North Korea case highlights the importance of addressing the potential abuse of the NPT's withdrawal clause. North Korea is the only state to have withdrawn from the treaty after violating its obligations and pursuing a clandestine nuclear weapons program. NPT states parties should make clear that a withdrawing state would remain responsible for any violations it committed while still in the treaty and be subject to international sanctions and limitations in nuclear cooperation. I appreciate the opportunity to provide my views to the subcommittees today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Mr. Rademacher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure for me to be here today. I appreciate the invitation. Like the other witnesses, I have a prepared statement, which I invite you to read. I will use the 5 minutes that I have to summarize.
Mr. Rademacher, is your microphone on?
It is on.
Hey, pull a little closer, please. Thanks.
I'm sorry, are you able to hear me now? Okay. I will use my 5 minutes to summarize my prepared remarks. My prepared remarks touch on three principal topics. First, I review and assess the effectiveness of the NPT as a treaty over the past 50 years. Second, I look at the threats posed by Iran and North Korea. And then third, I address the continued importance to the preservation of the nuclear non-proliferation treaty regime of the U.S. nuclear umbrella. And I argue that the U.S. nuclear umbrella has been the single most powerful tool that the United States has had over the past 50 years to discourage other countries from breaking out of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And probably, after Iran and North Korea, the biggest threat to the NPT would be if countries came to doubt the reliability of the U.S. nuclear umbrella. So, first, with regard to the history of the NPT, I note that there's a debate. Some people say it's a wonderful treaty, one of the most successful in history. Others say it's basically a failed treaty, and if we don't immediately have progress on nuclear disarmament, it's going to collapse. I come down on the glass half full rather than glass half empty side of that debate. I cite a number of examples that show that, in my view, the NPT has been remarkably successful over the last 50 years. I point out that prior to the NPT, among the countries in the world that had nuclear weapons programs, countries that were taking steps to produce nuclear weapons included Sweden, Switzerland, Australia, Italy. The NPT put an end to the nuclear weapons aspirations of those kinds of countries. I point out that after the treaty was signed, there were still a number of countries that debated whether to join the treaty. And most importantly among that list would be South Korea. They took a long time to come around to decide they wanted to join this treaty. Taiwan, Romania, Argentina, Brazil, Yugoslavia, these were all countries that debated whether they wanted to give up nuclear weapons. They ultimately decided to do so. Then I talk about the rogue state problem. Had we held this hearing 20 years ago, the rogue states that were toying with the idea, and actually these were all countries that had signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty but had embarked on programs to break out of the treaty, to deploy nuclear weapons in violation of the treaty. The list then would have included Iraq, Syria, Libya, as well as Iran and North Korea. And it's actually a great success that today the list of rogue states that's looking at breaking out of the treaty is down to two. It's down to Iran and North Korea. Now, with regard to Iran and North Korea, the threat is twofold, the threat that they pose to the NPT. Should they succeed in their nuclear ambitions, there's the threat of unraveling of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And in their particular regions, Northeast Asia and the Middle East, there is the special problem or the special risk of a cascade of nuclear proliferation as the neighbors of those countries, feeling threatened by the nuclear weapons programs of Iran and North Korea, decide that they need nuclear weapons too. I point out that in Northeast Asia, the risk is minimized by the fact that both South Korea and Japan live under the U.S. nuclear umbrella. They are treaty allies of the United States, so the United States is able to argue to them, you don't need your own nuclear weapons. We will protect you. You can rely on America's nuclear weapons. So far, that has worked. But As I pointed out, South Korea had a nuclear weapons program in the 1970s. Public opinion surveys in in South Korea today consistently show about 2/3 of the South Korean people think South Korea should have nuclear weapons. Why don't they? So far, they've been content to rely on the U.S. nuclear umbrella, but we need to preserve that. In the case of Japan, there's less popular support in opinion surveys for producing nuclear weapons. But if you look at what the government has done, they sit on a stockpile of 10 tons of plutonium that they maintain in Japan, and they've invested tens of billions of dollars in creating a new production facility that will produce vast quantities of plutonium going forward, should they start it. So they've positioned themselves to break out if they choose to. And it needs to be a top priority of ours to persuade them not to, and that links to, again, the importance of the U.S. nuclear umbrella. In the Middle East, a similar situation. Turkey is a country that feels threatened by the potential of Iranian nuclear weapons. They're a treaty ally of the United States, so we can make the same argument to them that they can rely on nuclear weapons, America's nuclear weapons, to protect them. Saudi Arabia, the other major country that feels deeply threatened by Iran's nuclear weapons, they can't rely on the U.S. nuclear umbrella. They are not a treaty ally of the United States. And as a consequence, we see the remarks of Mohammed bin Salman, who basically said, if Iran gets nuclear weapons, rest assured we're going to get nuclear weapons too. I know there's a lot of indignation in the United States, shock that Saudi Arabia would consider such a thing. I don't think we should be shocked. I think we should understand that this is an entirely logical and predictable response by South Korea to the threat of Iranian nuclear weapons. To me, those remarks don't tell us that we have a Saudi Arabia problem. They tell me we have an Iran problem. We need to deal with the Iranian nuclear threat and make sure they never acquire nuclear weapons, or otherwise we'll face a risk of a Saudi nuclear weapons program. The only tool that's proven effective in persuading countries that feel threatened by their neighbors' nuclear weapons not to produce their own nuclear weapons has been the U.S. nuclear umbrella. And I'll put that question to you. Is the United States prepared to extend its nuclear umbrella to Saudi Arabia? Are we prepared to become a treaty ally of Saudi Arabia? Are we prepared to station troops in Saudi Arabia as a human tripwire so that Saudi Arabia knows it can rely on the U.S. nuclear umbrella? If the answer to that is no,
Thank you, Mr. Rad.
we will have little to offer to prevent Saudi Arabia from responding.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Rademacher. I'll now turn to myself for opening questions. I'll then recognize the ranking member and our other members for 5 minutes for the purposes of questioning the witnesses. Ambassador Jenkins, 10 years ago, you sat before this committee as an Obama appointee to discuss the nuclear strategy summits at a hearing before the 2010 NPT Review Conference. This year, I understand you'll be involved in the 2020 NPT Review Conference as an outside government participant. From your point of view, what were some of the main differences between the 2010 Review Conference and the lead up to the 2020 Review Conference, and also just kind of laying the ground for us and putting things in perspective? What's the mood leading up to this year's conference, and are states more or less optimistic, and why do you think that is?
Thank you. My mind races on that question. In the last review conference, one of the main problems that we had with that, and was not successful, is, just 2010 and 2015. So the 2010 conference, there was obviously, there were still concerns about North Korea. I think that the concerns with North Korea now are a lot more serious. And this has been now versus 2015 or 2010, because we've had a situation where we've had an opportunity to try to make a change. And I think the international community probably sees it as the lack of progress after we tried to make a change is obviously kind of a negative, an attempt that was made that was not successful, and may be seen as a step backwards. We had, during 2010 and 2015, and I'll talk about both, is we had the 64 points, agreements that were made on steps that countries need to take to strengthen the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The feeling now is that we have not really made a lot of progress on any of those points, and if anything, we've stepped backwards. I think in 2015 particularly, we had a situation where we were not sure what was going to happen with Iran. There was still some questions about their activities. The difference between now and then is that we've actually had an agreement. We had a situation where Iran was abiding by this agreement, and now we don't. Now the agreement is falling apart. In addition, we don't know what's going to be happening with that. We also had a situation where there was a lot more discussion about the disarmament Article 6 and whether there was going to be any kind of discussions about a disarmament treaty, which is always an issue. In between 2015 and now, for example, we have a treaty that was agreed to at the UN in 2017 for disarmament, which unfortunately does not have any nuclear weapon states who are party to it. There are some questions about the treaty, in fact, about whether it can be verified, any verification mechanisms. Regardless of that, there has been a movement by non-nuclear weapon states, to actually move forward on Article 6, and you have the nuclear weapon states that have not.
So it sounds like we may have gone backwards.
We have come backwards, and I think the mood right now going in there, in light of everything we've said about the START treaty, INF treaty, there's also the fact that countries are wondering about what the nuclear weapon states are doing in modernization and building new, smaller types of nuclear weapons. All of that, in a nutshell, means that it's not a very positive outlook right now, and we didn't have a successful one in a review conference in 20.
Thank you, Ambassador Jenkins. In the brief time I have left, Mr. Rademacher, I agree with you. I think the U.S. approach to the nuclear umbrella has served us well and has kept other states that clearly have the capabilities to acquire nuclear weapons from going in that direction. Just in the last 30 seconds or so that I have, you talked about Saudi Arabia and the Middle East and Turkey. What is your opinion about extending nuclear guarantees to the Saudis to keep them from obtaining those nuclear capabilities?
Well, again, that's a political call. To extend, it's not just a matter of extending a guarantee. It would have to be credibly extended. And the way we have credibly extended it to other countries is really twofold. We've legally obligated ourselves by mutual defense treaties, and then we've backed up that legal obligation with American troops on the ground. And let's be clear, the 30,000 American soldiers on the DMZ in Korea, the American soldiers we deployed to Germany during the Cold War, their real mission was to get killed in an event of a war. That was their mission. And that's what made our nuclear guarantee credible, because it was a signal, taking the Korean Peninsula as an example, it was a signal to both North Korea and South Korea. If war breaks out here, we're going to take so many casualties that we will be involved. Neither side should be under any illusion that the American guarantee is non-credible, because we're going to have so many people killed here, we're going to have to come in. So that's why North Korea has to understand that South Korea is protected, and South Korea can rely on this legal commitment. And so the question is, are we prepared to do that for Saudi Arabia? And that's a question for Congress, not for outside experts.
Right.
I'm kind of skeptical.
Thank you. Let me go ahead and recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes to question the witnesses.
Thank you, Chairman. And I don't know if I'll sleep better tonight, but I appreciate your testimony. In 2018, the rate of growth in nuclear energy hit a 25-year high. I've got several questions. How does this growth impact U.S. non-proliferation efforts, keeping in mind your recommendations that you already gave us moving forward? What is your recommendation to update and modernize the NPT? When it was created, very few countries had the capacity or technology to have nuclear weapons. As the chairman brought up, I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. I remember the drills where we're supposed to duck under our school desks like that was going to do any good. But they had us convinced that was the thing to do. The weapons and delivery systems weren't as near advanced or destructive as they are today. And the nuclear material stockpiles back when this was formed was not as near as large as they are today. And I believe I was at a meeting last night, and if I heard it correctly, I think they said there was over 2,000 tons of stored spent nuclear material. So we're in such a different situation today than we were then. And we didn't have the rogue nations. I guess we did, but they weren't as vocal as they are today. In addition, we didn't have the non-state terrorist actors that can get a hold of this. So moving forward, how do we modernize this to try to be more encompassing? And I agree with you, Mr. Rademacher, about expanding America's nuclear umbrella. You know, again, we don't want to be the policeman of the world, but I think we need to be a strong deterrent at the same time. So I'd like to hear from whoever wants to weigh in on that.
I'll start. I know, knowing the witnesses, I think we each have maybe some different comments. Just to be quick so that we each have time, the immediate response I have, having spent some time in the nuclear energy sector as well, so pure civilian nuclear energy sector, is that advances, back to my technology point, advances in technology enable us to do much stronger detection and monitoring of any breakout than we had previously. And so applying those in a manner that lets us support the nuclear, civilian, peaceful use of nuclear energy, but yet continue to monitor and prevent the misuse is, I think, an important aspect. The state and non-state actor side and the waste and use of nuclear materials that might not be a nuclear event, but a radiological incident is much harder. And that is where I think there's many other tools that we would need to bring to bear, some of which you've heard about today, and Proliferation Security Initiative and others included, but I yield to my other.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Mr. Johnson.
Congressman Yoho, I would say a few things quickly. I think the growth in nuclear energy is a reminder that as you have more nuclear material in the world, you have more need to actually monitor and verify that nuclear material. And so I would say the key here is support for the International Atomic Energy Agency. Their budget is under strain, particularly on the safeguard side. And I also would say that new developers of nuclear reactors, there's a lot of actual promise potentially in these new small modular reactors and other advanced reactors. But in designing these things, I think that these designers need to take into account not just safety and security, but also safeguards so that a future IAEA can monitor to make sure that there's no diverted material. And lastly, I would say, as I mentioned in my remarks, I think there's a lot of promise in advanced technologies. We have a concept called wide area environmental sampling, which if developed and if cost effective, might allow you to address this concern about undetected nuclear activity, where you could actually use things that have been stationed throughout the country, potentially using drones and other things, to pick up sense of nuclear material that you might not obviously be able to in the past, but that's going to require research and development.
Is that like anti-neutrino technology?
Neutrinos can be a part of it. There's lots of developments in sensors and technology. And the other thing I would say is the advances in data analysis allow us to use really big data to analyze much bigger pieces of information. The IAEA is starting to do some of that now, but there's lots more work to be done.
Mr. Rademacher.
So quickly, I would say I think there's almost no chance diplomatically of negotiating amendments to the NPT or a follow-on treaty to the NPT. I think the focus has to be on practical measures that reinforce the NPT. You're absolutely right. The technology is much more widespread today. You could go on the internet and find much of what you need to build a nuclear weapon. The key constraint, the key choke point, is obtaining fissile material that's in highly enriched uranium or plutonium.
Right.
And so I think our main focus has to be on making sure that countries do not develop those capabilities. And we've put a lot of effort into that. There was a thing called the gold standard, which tried to get other countries to agree they would never enrich or reprocess. I think the Obama administration dealt probably a fatal blow to the gold standard when it agreed that Iran could enrich, because it becomes impossible to argue to our friends that they shouldn't enrich if we've agreed that our adversaries can enrich.
I'm going to have to stop you there because I'm out of time, but I really appreciate that. Thank you.
The gentleman from Florida, Chairman Deutsch, is recognized to question the witness for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Bera. Mr. Johnson, I'll start with you since you brought up the IAEA. I want to talk about the NPT and Iran in light of the reports this morning about the JCPOA and Iran. We've already seen Iranian noncompliance. I mentioned that in my opening remarks. But now this morning, the news that the IAEA is reporting challenges accessing sites. They may name those sites in the report. Additionally, we know they're enriching to levels that exceed the JCPOA's 3.67% limit. And now the news this morning that the reports this morning that their stockpile may be as much as 5 times higher than that permitted under the terms of the JCPOA. The question is, what does all of this mean for Iran and the NPT? And they've threatened several times already to withdraw from it. How seriously do you assess that threat? And given what we've heard about their current reports, where does this all go? How damaging would it be if Iran withdrew from the NPT? And then if you want to talk a minute about these reports and the increased stockpiles and how concerned we should be about that, I would appreciate it.
Thank you, Chairman Deutsch. To quickly answer your question, it would be very damaging if Iran withdrew from the NPT. I think it's concerning that the Iranian government has on several occasions mentioned this as a possibility. That having been said, I am a slight optimist in this regard, only because the strength of the treaty is such that other countries, including countries that have closer relations with Iran, like Russia and China, I think would take great alarm at Iran basically following the path of North Korea. So I think there is some pressure there that can be used multilaterally to sort of suss out whether these are purely political statements that have certain effects within Iran or actual statements of intent to move away from the NPT. I also agree with you that, again, the IAEA system is fundamental here, and I would divide this into 2 segments. We have the monitoring and verification that the agency does as part of the JCPOA. And I think the good news there is that despite all the negative moves that Iran has taken to step away from the deal, what they have not undermined is the monitoring and verification of those declared sites under the JCPOA. This is actually why we now know that there are increases in the amount of material. However, the problem is that we are seeing this concern about the broader comprehensive safeguards agreement, where they are not apparently offering access to facilities where there are questions that actually go outside of their JCPOA commitments. And on that, I would say it's incumbent upon, and I applaud the work of the new Director General, Rafael Grossi, to highlight this. And it's incumbent upon Iran to cooperate in this regard. I think even those who would say they were strong supporters of the JCPOA would argue that it is not in the interest of Iran to stonewall this work. And at the end of the day, it is fundamental to the maintenance of the NPT regime that the IAEA be able to do its independent technical work.
Right. Let me take a slightly less rosy view, if I may. Your reference to the JCPOA and access to the declared sites is one thing, but the fact that this report may indicate at least 1, maybe 2 sites that have not been declared raises a whole series of other alarms, I think. That's number 1. Number 2, other countries may have great interest in ensuring that Iran remains in the NPT, but if with the enrichment levels now exceeding those under the JCPOA and the stockpile now dramatically, my word, although 5 times, 1,500 kilograms versus 300 kilograms, there's going to be some discussion about whether that's sufficient for a nuclear weapon. I'd love your thoughts on that. But it's a dramatic increase, dramatically more than that which is permitted under the JCPOA. Given the direction that Iran seems to be going there, how serious, I guess I'd ask a more direct question, how serious can we take the assertion that Iran recognizes that it's in its interest to remain part of the NPT?
And I will never speak on behalf of the Iranian regime, of course, but I would just say this. First of all, I agree with you that it's concerning that the stockpile has grown very much, and I do think that there's been a reduction, certainly, in the breakout timeline. My comment on the declared facilities—
What do you think that reduction is to?
I am not a nuclear physicist, so I'm not going to guess, but it's certainly, I would say it is less it is still greater than it was before the JCPOA, when it was about 6 to 8 weeks, but it is certainly less than it was with the JCPOA, which was about 1 year. So it's somewhere in between those things. But I would just say on your comment about undeclared facilities, I completely agree, and this is why it's very important for the additional protocol to be implemented and ultimately ratified. It's important to point out that the Iranians have previously allowed access to undeclared facilities under the AP. It's concerning that they're not doing that currently, but they need to comply with their obligations under the additional protocol.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all the witnesses. Thanks.
Gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Wilson, is recognized for 5 minutes to question witnesses.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank each of you for being here today. And Mr. Rademacher, I'd like to point out I'm very grateful that you and I have a shared appreciation of having attended schools at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. Although with 3 degrees, you've really done quite well. You're practically a native of the region. With that in mind, Mr. Rademacher, evidence from the Iranian nuclear archive released courageously by our valued ally Israel suggests that Iran never halted its 2003-era nuclear weapons program, only downsized, better hid, and concealed portions of relevant civilian and military institutions. Do you believe that Iran is continuing nuclear weaponization-related projects from the 2003 era, which constitute a key activity necessary to produce nuclear devices?
Do I believe they're continuing that today?
Yes.
I don't have access to intelligence anymore, so I can't give you a truly informed opinion on that. I will say Iran is a serial cheater. I mean, part of the reason the world has long suspected that they are pursuing nuclear weapons is that they did a whole series of things covertly and only acknowledged what they were doing when they were confronted with hard evidence, and it's a pattern that's repeated. I mean, we're reading today about suspect sites. We haven't heard about that in a while, but there have long been suspect sites in Iran. So this is not a new story. This is just the old story repeating itself. I think at this point they are playing a game. They're trying to pressure the Europeans to give them a better deal. I would distinguish between breaking out of the NPT and breaking out of the JCPOA. I think much easier for them to break out of the JCPOA. I do think for them to break out of the NPT would be a dramatic step that would cost them dearly. One point I make in my testimony is we can agree or disagree about whether Trump did the right thing in terminating the JCPOA. I think everybody would agree, though, that the reimposition of U.S. sanctions on Iran has been astonishingly effective, far more effective than I would have predicted, far more effective than I did predict, actually, because I testified on the issue back before he broke out. At the height of President Obama's policy of pressuring Iran through U.S. sanctions, Iran was, when that policy was at maximum effectiveness, Iran was exporting 1.2 million barrels a day of oil. Today, Iran is exporting 500,000 barrels of oil a day, more or less. So vastly more effective. They are feeling pain, and that's without real cooperation from the rest of the world. If Iran could do a series of things that would lead the rest of the world to want to join the United States in applying maximum pressure, and then I think they would find themselves in an even more dire situation. So I think there remains leverage that the world can bring to bear. And I think Iran's actually playing a dangerous game, threatening to pull the plug on the JCPOA.
Thank you very much. And although when you mentioned the Obama sanctions, I'm thinking of what they did to provide $150 billion to the regime in Tehran, and I think of the $1.8 billion in cash delivered to Tehran International Airport. And so that whatever sanctions there were, that's amazing. But indeed, I appreciate President Trump's leadership. Ambassador Jenkins, I want to thank you for your State Department service on behalf of our country. Critics of the NPT point out that the failure to contain states like Iran from flagrantly violating their responsibility under the treaty. Heading into the review conference, what should the U.S. priorities in terms of be to strengthen the NPT?
I think one of the first things that the U.S. should do is approach the NPT with the recognition and making a positive statement about the importance of nonproliferation, the importance of the role that the United States wants to continue to play in nonproliferation. And I think that there should be a recognition of the role, that the perception of the role that U.S. has played in the Iran situation, and an explanation and an understanding of what the U.S. is doing and an understanding of what the situation has been with North Korea, and make it very clear what that situation is. But I also think that we should approach it with some decisions about START, for example. I think that if we don't make statements that show that we are committed to things like the START agreement, that there will still be a perception that the U.S. is not doing what it should be doing to fulfill Article 6. And I think we're in a dilemma where we need to take steps that I think that we really don't want to take. And the steps that we don't want to take are the very steps that would strengthen the perception that others have of the U.S. in its role in the NPT.
Thank
So
you very much.
Yeah. So.
My time is up, but thank you, Ambassador.
The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, is recognized to question the witness for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to the panel. Thank you for your thoughtful testimony. Mr. Rademacher said we have an Iranian problem, and I think you were talking about potential impact on Turkey and Saudi Arabia making their decisions about nuclear development program, and I would agree with that. Obviously, what Iran does is going to have an impact on those two critical nations. But, in listening to the discussion, you would think that Iran is just, in a malign way, cheating, and that it was Iran that renounced the JCPOA. Mr. Johnson, remind me, who was it who walked away from the JCPOA?
Congressman Connolly, that would be the United States.
That would be the United States of America. That's right. My friend from South Carolina praises President Trump. I do the opposite. I think he has created an unstable situation in the region. What is it we expect Iran to do? If the United States walks away from its own agreement, which the Obama administration and the early Trump administration and the IAEA said was abiding by the metrics set in the agreement with respect to centrifuges, with respect to enriched uranium, with respect to shipping out excessively enriched uranium, with respect to the concretizing of the plutonium production reactor, they were in full compliance, according to the IAEA. And we walked away from that agreement. And the truth of the matter is we walked away from it because it was Obama's. And Trump couldn't abide it. And he's willing to risk the instability of the entire region and the development of a nuclear Iran because of petty rivalry and jealousy over a very significant achievement by the United States, its allies, and adversaries. I mean, one would be hard-pressed to find any kind of agreement that had Russia, China, the Europeans, Iran, and the United States reaching an agreement, unprecedented. And by renouncing our own agreement, we have destabilized that region. And if Iran doesn't want to abide by JCPOA, I regret that. I wish they would, but one can certainly understand why they might not. Why should they abide by an agreement we ourselves have renounced and have pressured our allies to add to those sanctions you talk about, Mr. Rademacher? And yes, they're effective, but they hardly seem to be if you're going to have an agreement like this, you're going to have a carrot and a stick. All I see are sticks. I don't see the carrots, and by doing that, we have weakened the hand of those like Rouhani who were arguing for engagement with the West. Would you agree with that, Mr. Johnson?
Congressman, I would say that my understanding of current Iranian domestic politics, and there's really good polling done by the University of Maryland on this, is that support for the JCPOA has dropped precipitously since the Trump administration left the agreement. And so prior to the deal, there was actually majority support for the JCPOA and engagement that has now gone to minority support.
Right. So a little bit of history and context, I think, is called for here. We're the ones who precipitated this by walking away from our own agreement. And now there are consequences. And there are real consequences that need to be contained. We have to look at alternatives to the kinetic option, which some in the region have always favored, but that's not in U.S. interest, and it won't achieve its goals from my point of view. Switching subjects, Mr. Johnson, you said we must extend the New START treaty. Tell us why. Why is that treaty so important?
Congressman, as I understand it, the New START treaty is basically the last remaining treaty that is a part of the U.S.-Russia arms control mechanism. And there's, of course, a long history, even in the darkest days of the Cold War, in which the United States and the Soviet Union saw a shared concern for the nuclear arms race. So if this treaty expires, and it would expire early in 2021, there would no longer be any limit on the deployment of nuclear warheads and weapons.
So it's really important. There's not much else left if we don't do this. But do you see any evidence of the Trump administration moving expeditiously or with any kind of sense of urgency to, in fact, renew or at least extend the New START treaty?
My understanding is that the administration continues to discuss this, but I would just point out that the action to take would be very simple. It actually does not even require an act of Congress. It would simply be a signature by the two countries, so it wouldn't require that much effort in that regard.
Yes, one would hope that some sense of urgency might descend upon the administration with respect to this. My time is up. I thank the chair.
Thank you. The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry, is recognized to question the witness for 5 minutes.
Thank the chairman. Thank you, folks, for coming and testifying today. And I want to continue to add some historical context, at least from my viewpoint, to the JCPOA and the events that have followed. And actually, the events that preceded. Since 1978, Iran has vowed that the United States is an enemy. And I don't know if it's a newsflash to anybody in this room, but they've been a lying, duplicitous, terrorist, theocratic regime since it started in 1978, and they haven't changed. And I think it'd be foolhardy, it'd be irresponsibly, patently absurd to believe that they have any good faith to do anything without verifying it first. Matter of fact, and it's already been stated here this morning, that the IAEA admonished Tehran for failing to provide access to two undeclared locations, and as Mr. Rademacher said, that's not anything new. Well, for heaven's sakes, folks, the fact that it's not anything new should concern us greatly, that this is our partner in a deal that we made that refuses to and has a history of hiding the information on which the deal is pinned upon. Before this, Iran had been seen as behaving under NPT compliance by some friends of mine, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle here, but certainly not by me. Iran has conducted various tests against the terms of the JCPOA even before the advent of the administration's maximum pressure strategy. In May of 2017, Iran conducted a failed cruise missile test in the Straits of Hormuz, launched several short-range ballistic missiles in August 2018, expected to export this design to North Korea, conducted 2 medium-range ballistic missile launches in March and December of 2017. In October 2015, just mere months before the JCPOA came into effect, Iran launched its first precision-guided missile. Iran conducted other ballistic missile launches in July of 2016 and January of 2017, which North Korea has since received the technology for. From 2015 to 2018, Iran launched at least 23 ballistic missiles against the terms of the JCPOA. Do I need to remind anybody in the room that there's only one reason to have ballistic missiles? There's only one reason. It's a delivery system. They're not delivering leaflets or packs of candy to church children. They're delivering, their aim is to deliver nuclear weapons to the United States and Israel. That's the plan. Why would any of us seek to allow this? It's to me, this is patently absurd. And so we have our critics saying that, well, the United States hasn't been adequately drawing down according to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. We've drawn down almost 90%, almost 90%. Our enemies, God bless them, would like us to draw down to 0. That's what they would like. Sure, they would like that. And as far as Iran and being upset with the United States withdrawing from the JCPOA, well, I'm sure they are, because it didn't stop them from doing anything. all it did was delay them. If they followed it, quite clearly, according to the IAEA, they weren't following it anyhow. But let's just say they did. It's not a question of if, it was a question of when. A question of when. And so, with all due respect to our adversaries and our enemies and their opinions about what we should or we shouldn't do, for this member of Congress, I'm not going to be seeking their advice and counsel on what's great for the United States or the free world. I don't seek the advice and counsel of despots, terrorists, and theocratic totalitarians. Mr. Rademacher, I don't know if you've had a chance to say everything that you want to, but I got about 40 seconds left if you want to add anything to my discord with some of my great colleagues and friends on the other side of the aisle.
Well, maybe I will just amplify one point you made about nuclear disarmament. I spent a lot of time talking about the importance of the nuclear umbrella, and I think these people who say we should abandon nuclear weapons as soon as possible, I think they're in good faith, but I think they kind of miss the big picture about what the consequence of that would be, because it would not be that everyone else would be inspired by our fine example to do exactly the same thing. Quite the opposite. I think a guy like Kim Jong-un would be even more excited about being potentially the only leader on the planet with nuclear weapons. I mean, I don't think he would be deterred at all in pursuing nuclear weapons if the U.S. didn't have them. And with regard to Article 6 of the NPT, which is often cited as this legal obligation on the part of the United States to disarm, that provision, I invite all of you to read it. I'll read it to you if you want. It's one sentence long, pretty easy to digest, and its meaning has been incredibly distorted by the proponents of nuclear disarmament. The actual obligation, it actually runs in three directions. Not just the United States, but all the nuclear weapon states are supposed to negotiate or required to negotiate in good faith on effective measures relating to nuclear disarmament. It's not that they're to achieve nuclear disarmament. They're to negotiate in good faith on measures relating to nuclear disarmament. And then all of the other countries, the entire rest of the world, or not the entire rest of the world, all the other NPT parties, which is virtually the entire rest of the world, they're required to negotiate on a treaty on general and complete disarmament. And the NPT makes clear that one day we may achieve nuclear disarmament, but that's going to happen pursuant to a treaty on general and complete disarmament. So when when India and Pakistan disarm because they're no longer at each other's throats, and when
Thank you, Mr.
Russia and China,
My time has expired.
Then we have disarmament. And that's the vision of the NPT, and that's a vision that's very inconvenient
Thanks,
for those
Mr.
who want
Rademacher.
immediate disarmament.
The gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Cicilline, is recognized to question the witness for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and I thank the chairman and the ranking members for this very important hearing and the witnesses for your very critical testimony. As I think about the discussion today, of course, international agreements and treaties, in order to be successful, require the confidence that the parties will honor their commitments to an agreement. And so that one of the issues I think Mr. Connolly raises is how does the United States walking away from the JCPOA impact the credibility of the United States in other international agreements? And I think that problem is compounded because the NPT doesn't have within it a mechanism for determining if a state that is party to the treaty has violated its obligations, and no formal procedure in place for dealing with such violations. So, Mr. Johnson, I want to start with you. The agreement, the treaty requires that the review happen every 5 years, and that review the operation of the treaty. What's the purpose of that review? Is it simply to surface non-compliance? Is it contemplated that parties would agree to some modifications? And related to that, what is your view as to the most coherent strategy for the United States to go into that conference?
Thank you, Congressman. I think it's important to remember that these review conferences began when the NPT had an expiration date. So part of the reason to have these review conferences was to decide whether to extend the treaty, and there were extension conferences. Thankfully, in 1995, the treaty was extended indefinitely, but the review conferences continue. I would see these review conferences as a bit like a regular physical. It's a check-in to see the health of the treaty. And as my other colleagues up here have mentioned, I think the treaty is a little bit of disrepair. There's some concerns not only on the disarmament side, but on cases like Iran and North Korea. I would point out that while the treaty itself may not have an enforcement mechanism, the fact that it mandates IAEA safeguards around the world, and the fact that the violation of those commitments can lead to the reporting to the UN Security Council, which is what has led to the extremely strong sanctions on both North Korea and Iran, which I helped to craft, is an incredibly effective enforcement mechanism. So I would say that the strategy moving forward, I think we have a tough spot right now because of concerns about disarmament, because of concerns about U.S. steps to step away from the JCPOA and from the INF, and uncertainty about New START. But I do think the important point here is to sort of at first do no harm and try to reaffirm all of the positive elements that we've seen in the JCPOA, in the NPT. And if there are elements from the JCPOA, that's great. If there's elements from North Korea, that's fine. But the most important thing here is I am concerned that there could be steps that actually further devalue the value of the treaty when we should actually be pushing for universality.
And to follow up on the discussion about our Article 6 obligations, you know, it's my understanding that the non-nuclear parties to this treaty joined it in part on the representation that the nuclear powers would engage in a good faith effort to disarm. And I'm particularly interested in your assessment of the United States' actions as it relates to disarmament, particularly with our failure to extend the New START treaty, the INF decision, and the walking away from the JCPOA. I mean, it seems to me we've put ourselves in a very difficult position to make the case that the United States has led an effort, a good faith effort in nuclear disarmament. And in fact, I think people would have a good argument to say that we have taken steps which undermine such a claim. What's your assessment?
Well, first of all, I would say I would associate myself with the comments of Mr. Rademacher that the treaty, that the actual text of Article 6 is a little bit broader in question. But I do think it's still important to show our commitment to that leg of the treaty. And I think the elements that you've mentioned do raise concerns from our non-nuclear weapon state partners that there has not been enough progress made. I would submit that in 2010, one of the reasons that the review conference then was so successful was because of the ratification of the New START treaty. That gave a little bit of a sugar boost to that review conference. It could be very positive if the New START treaty were renewed for 5 years. Again, a very simple thing that could be done. That would be a really big positive element to a review conference. The other thing I would say is that, you know, even a basic statement, a statement like President Reagan and Chairman Gorbachev made in the 80s, that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought, or some variation on that, if that could be made by the US and Russia, or even better by the P5 nuclear states, I know it's just simply a statement, but I think our non-nuclear weapon states colleagues are looking for something to grasp onto, and that could be a positive element.
In my last 15 seconds for any of the witnesses, what greater role could the IAEA play in ensuring the parties to the NPT are in compliance, if anything? And what should we do to support that additional role? Ambassador?
Well, I would just say briefly that the IAEA has been playing a very good role in terms of its safeguards. I think it could reaffirm the importance of safeguards, reaffirm the importance of all countries agreeing to the additional protocols, highlight what it has been able to accomplish in the Iran situation, and highlight the importance of whatever they're working on now with Iran, but also highlight the fact that the IAEA is playing such a big role in so many other aspects on the nuclear front, including on the cyber issue, some of the new technology we talked about, the nuclear energy issues. So they're playing a very strong role, not only in the safeguards, in the security, but also in other areas of the nuclear non-proliferation issue.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady from Missouri, Ms. Wagner, is recognized to question the witness for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for organizing this hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for their time and for their service. As the administration said in its 2018 Nuclear Posture Review, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT, remains fundamental to the global non-proliferation regime. We must ensure our non-proliferation tools are strong and varied enough to meet challenges from bad actors like Iran and North Korea. At a recent meeting of the United Nations Disarmament and International Security Committee, Russia and China voted against calls for North Korea to re-enter the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Yesterday, Remember, meanwhile, North Korea sent 2 short-range ballistic missiles into the Sea of Japan. There's so much going on, we don't even hear about this activity anymore. Mr. Rademacher, how seriously are Russia and China undermining efforts to rein in the Kim regime's nuclear ambitions? And how can the United States use the upcoming NPT review to restore broad international support for North Korean denuclearization?
Thank you, Congresswoman. It's a very good question. I address it in my prepared remarks. You know, there's a refrain that we hear very regularly from the State Department, from our U.S. officials who deal with China on the question of North Korea. And what they always come back saying is, you know, the Chinese, they want to help, their heart's in the right place, but they've got these constraints, they're doing the best they can, we're going to try and get them to do some more. And I've heard that so many times.
Over and over and over again.
For so many years that I've stopped believing it. You know, I mentioned in my testimony that in the 1970s, South Korea had a nuclear weapons program. And they were our ally. When we found out about it, we went to them and said, you've got to stop this.
Right.
You want us to defend you? We're telling you, you don't need nuclear weapons. You can rely on our nuclear weapons. You can rely on our security guarantee. You have to stop this. And they did. You know, North Korea is a treaty ally of China. They have a mutual defense treaty. China is in the position to do to North Korea what we did with South Korea. They've just never done it. And they have a lot of good stories about, oh, we're worried about refugees, we're worried about economic collapse. You know, the reality is that if you assess it, this nuclear problem on the Korean Peninsula, they decided a long time ago it was our problem, not their problem. It works out to their advantage in a whole bunch of ways. It makes it makes South Korea and Japan much more dependent on China.
Thank you. And I have some more questions. I have to say, let's hope at this NPT review we can restore this broad international support for this to move forward. Under the NPT, nuclear weapons states may not help non-nuclear countries develop nuclear weapons systems. Pakistan, which has so far refused to join the NPT, was involved in the development of North Korea's growing nuclear capabilities. Mr. Rademacher, how can the international community pressure Pakistan to adhere to the goals of the NPT?
I guess I would say candidly that will be a long-term project because
hell will freeze over. Is that what you're saying? Yeah. Okay.
I mean, the NPT has been a phenomenally successful treaty. You know, really, there are only at this point 4 countries that have never signed it. One of them is South Sudan, and that you know, that's a problem that will take care of itself. But India, Pakistan, and Israel have not signed it. They're probably not on track to do so anytime soon. As between India and Pakistan, you know, both countries have nuclear weapons. They are, you know, security threats to one another. They perceive threats from one another. I don't think the international community has a solution that we've identified that will persuade those two countries to give up nuclear weapons.
In 1995, NPT party states agreed to establish a zone free of weapons of mass destruction, or WMDs, in the Middle East. Today, tragically, we are seeing states like Syria actively engaging in the proliferation of WMDs with the support of Russia and Iran, both NPT signatories. Dr. Smith, how should the United States push for progress in the WMD non-proliferation at the review, and what mechanisms exist to bring Russia and Iran into line? In 5 seconds.
Thank you, Congresswoman. In 5 seconds, I'll be very short. I would go back to where you started your remarks, ma'am, with the other tools that are available. So regarding the NPT, I think we've spoken a lot, but there are a number of other tools that have been brought to bear in the Middle East through the cooperative threat reduction programs, proliferation security initiative. There's a long list of those. We need to continue to leverage those on all ends of that threat spectrum.
Great, thank you. My time has expired. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levins, recognized to question the witness for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Smith, let me stay with you for a minute. will Russia's violation of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, or the INF Treaty, and the U.S. withdrawal from the treaty in response, and the U.S. reluctance to extend New START, undermine the chances for a consensus outcome at the review conference?
Thank you, Congressman. And coming from Michigan, I'm always pleased to see 11 on the stage. So thank you for your service.
Thanks.
Great question. The implication of both of those treaties, to me, goes back to a fundamental point which I close with, which is how we communicate with partners or adversaries. So as we've noted, with the last remaining treaty being New START, if we have no other formal engagements in an arms control arena, and for long have been restricted on any other engagements with Russia related to arms control or threat reduction programs, our bandwidth for communication gets smaller and smaller, which drives us to the NPT, to your question. So I don't believe that there is, let me put it in a positive way, to some of the other witnesses' statements too, I do believe that if we could reach agreement on a New START continuation, again, with minimal lift, that would enable a stronger outcome for the NPT RevCon and enable stronger communication with that important nation.
That would be great. All right, Mr. Johnson, let me ask you a question about Iran. Do most parties to the NPT agree with the U.S. decision to withdraw from the JCPOA?
Congressman, I'm not sure that a poll was taken, but I would say that the vast majority of states supported the JCPOA and continue to support its implementation.
And does the U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA make future non-proliferation agreements easier to negotiate or harder to negotiate?
I think in the context of this treaty, I always think about North Korea, and the North Koreans are looking, while they're looking to negotiate something with the United States about the durability of any sort of agreement, and so especially a bilateral agreement. So I think it certainly raises concerns about this, as well as in the context of the other treaties and agreements we've mentioned, like the INF and New START potentially.
All right, thank you. Now let me way broaden the focus and ask all of you to think about the big picture with me. I'm a freshman in Congress. I'm a lifelong peace activist. I remember early in my adult life, in June of 1982, when nearly 1 million people demonstrated in New York City. Their slogan was, "Freeze the arms race and fund human needs." So here we are in early March 2020. We have new nuclear armed states. We have non-state actors. The threat of proliferation is, I think, very grave. My colleagues tire of hearing me talk about the threat of climate change and the urgent need to deal with that, but I think these two issues, nuclear weapons, proliferation, and climate change, are both existential threats to humanity. The press table is nearly empty. The gallery for the public is nearly empty. I despair at this situation. You all have devoted your lives to this. We bring the best experts we can find to testify before us. Let me start with you, Ambassador Jenkins. What do we need to do to mobilize the public and our political world to deal with the threat of nuclear weapons?
Thank you for the question. And it's certainly something that I've given a lot of thought to. And we definitely need to be better at outreach and education. I know a lot of organizations are actually trying to get outside DC, for example, and to start working with colleges and universities. My organization does a lot of that, working with young people to get them more interested, also trying to help them understand how to connect it to other issues that they may be concerned about. I would think maybe if it's climate change, it might be a few more people in here, but there's always been a challenge. It was great in the 80s, but there's always been a challenge in trying to get the average person to care a lot about nuclear issues, unless something big is happening.
Anyone else?
And we really have to connect it to something else that people care about.
Thanks. Anyone else want to jump in the last few seconds I have about this? Dr. Smith, go ahead.
trying not to jump over. The flip side is I would point out, if you look at who's here, it is a younger crowd, and I do believe it is bringing up the next generation. And then in turn, just I know as time is tight, I would also applaud you, and there are some programs to help bring up the understanding of these issues, even on the Hill and amongst our representatives, which is incredibly important as well. So thank you in turn for holding this hearing.
Thanks. All right, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Trone, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Smith, at the Pentagon, you focused on defending against chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear attack from terrorists, preventing trafficking of weapons from the terrorist groups. Other than Iran, we've talked a lot about Iran. What groups and states in the Middle East were the focus of your efforts, and how did the NPT and other non-proliferation mechanisms assist you?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. Top of mind, and as addressed in my written statement, is the Islamic State, but I do believe we often limit that too tightly. So in the Middle East, it is the Islamic State, but that has tendrils and groups that are affiliated globally or claim to be affiliated. I believe that should be the top of our minds in the sense of demonstrated interest, ability to develop, enhanced development over time, and enhanced delivery of those, in this case, mostly chemical weapons over time. So the necessity of being aware of and attuned to, and then developing more and more tools to combat that threat is, I think, paramount in that region particularly, and then globally.
Is anything happening right now in Saudi Arabia?
I don't have access to current intelligence, Congressman, I'm sorry.
Are there any other non-proliferation vehicles or agreements that would have empowered you as a Deputy Assistant Secretary to make your job more effective?
Thank you, Congressman. There are authorities that I think we should consider as we look at what the tools are that are available to us. In the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, which you have heard about, it has proved to be an evolving tool, back to my original remarks, with support from State Department and other actors in the government to add authorities, to add ability to work globally and in areas that we needed to work. There are others, though, that I think we need to consider. And I would also add that we need to consider the future impact of how we use some of those tools. And in that vein, I actually am thinking of sanctions and some of the financial levers where we depend on U.S. prevalence and depend on the support from our allies and partners. But should that be diminished, the effectiveness of those tools will also be diminished.
Thank you. Ambassador Jenkins, with regard to the upcoming NPT Review Conference, what type of statements and actions do you hope to see from the Trump administration to support and reaffirm global non-proliferation norms?
I would like to see a statement that reflects a strategy. One of the things that I feel is really lacking is a strategy on nonproliferation. And what is our strategy overall? And that strategy would include what we're doing with Iran and what we're doing with North Korea, and how everything we're doing fits into a particular strategy going forward. I think that would be very helpful for countries to understand what exactly is the U.S. really doing right now on nonproliferation, and getting a sense of, okay, this is our strategy and this is what we're going to be doing to promote nonproliferation. And I think having an understanding of that would be very useful. And then there's other things that we could be doing to say in that strategy about our role in Article 6, being more transparent about some of the things we're doing. So being more upfront, showing leadership, coming in strong and saying, yes, we do believe in this, and these are the things we're doing, this is why we're doing it, and we support the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Mr. Johnson, how effective has the U.S. been enlisting support from the other 4 official nuclear weapon states to address non-proliferation threats such as North Korea? Anybody helping out? Clearly not China.
I think generally speaking, there's very good cooperation amongst the P3, obviously, with our UK and French colleagues. I think Chinese cooperation sort of waxes and wanes depending upon the situation. My concern right now, actually, with China is that we had an uptick in cooperation with China, including on sanctions enforcement. But in the last year or so, I think we've seen that tick back down again. And some of that is because of the inability to get the negotiations going between the United States and North Korea. So in some ways, we actually had China on our side for a while. while because Xi Jinping did not actually really have a good relationship with Kim Jong-un. Unfortunately, I see that reversing. And in terms of Russia, I would just say that, again, there is certainly a lot of interest in areas where there is direct overlap. The Russians were actually extremely good with us working on the JCPOA. They are less involved on the issue of North Korea, and certainly there are concerns about Russian violations of things like the INF, though I think that those could have been worked out potentially within the treaty.
Experts, diplomats, Mr. Johnson, are not optimistic about anything happening, but if we could, at the NPT, but could we reach a consensus document? That's traditionally been the, marker of success. What else could be the sign of a successful conference?
I think the difficulty with the consensus document is that it's a very long document. So it would be sort of like getting members of the United States House of Representatives to agree on every single thing in a piece of paper. So I don't know if that's achievable. What I do think is achievable is there's broad consensus on many of these issues, and perhaps there's a way to highlight those even if there is no consensus document. And I would again point to the broad range of things that Dr. Smith pointed out, these other tools that are available both within the NPT, but the layers on top of them, including things like strengthening export controls and working on having effective sanctions regimes.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from California, Mr. Vargas, is recognized to question the witness for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Again, thank the ranking member for providing this opportunity to speak, and of course, I thank the witnesses here. I think the NPT has been incredibly successful. I was looking up the death total for World War II, and there's estimates that range from 70 to 85 million people were killed. And since the effective date of the NPT, we haven't had that level of carnage and massacre in the world. And I think the reason for that is because we have been able to come together as a world and say these nuclear weapons should not be used again. Interestingly, because I do think that it would be rational for some of these rogue states to have them. Certainly if I was a rogue state, the leader of one, I would want to have one because of the simple reason that if you're a nuclear weapon state, you don't get invaded. No one's going to invade you because they don't want a nuclear weapon dropped on their head. So it would make sense to get a nuclear weapon if you're a rogue state. But there has been, I think, the ability for the world to come together and say, either we'll put you under our umbrella or we'll make things so difficult for you that you shouldn't have nuclear weapons. One of the things, though, that did catch my attention, and I appreciate this discussion, was what you said, Mr. Rademacher. You said that if Iran were to withdraw from the NPT, that both Russia and China would have something to say about that in the negative. But at the same time, you said, well, wait a minute, China thinks that the problem of North Korea having nuclear weapons is our problem. Doesn't that kind of cut against your logic with respect to Iran?
You're correct. To some degree it does. I guess it's hard to predict how, certainly at a rhetorical level, both China and Russia would oppose Iranian withdrawal from the NPT. How angry they would really be about it, I guess, is a little bit harder to know. Iran is not very far from Russia. They both share the coastline of the Caspian Sea. So I do tend to believe that Russia really doesn't want Iran to have nuclear weapons. For China, the country's a little bit further away. It may be less of an issue for them.
Yet China's fine with North Korea having nuclear weapons, and it's so close to it. So why the logic? It seems that there's some fallacy in your logic there. If you have China being okay with North Korea having nuclear weapons, and that is our problem, why isn't it the same case with Iran having nuclear weapons?
I do think China probably calculates it has more influence at the end of the day over North Korea. They're treaty allies. They have a long shared history than Russia has over Iran. Because there isn't much affinity between the Iranian Revolution and the political situation in Russia.
Okay, the reason I say that is because I really do think that Iran is one of the nations, one of the rogue nations that if it had nuclear weapons might be willing to use it because of their theocracy, and I do think that's incredibly dangerous for them to have it. I also would agree with you, we made a terrible mistake in allowing them to enrich. That certainly was one of the weaknesses in the JCPOA, and I wish we wouldn't have done that. That being said, again, I hope that we can get the world, again, to come together and to put more of a focus on how do we stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, because, again, I think that they're proceeding in a way that they believe is rational to get the weapon. I do want to ask, though, about Russia and ourselves. It seems to me that it would make sense for us to start to bring down our arsenals in a way that's meaningful. Russia is not a very wealthy nation. In fact, if you take a look at what happened last time with the buildup of weapons in their country and the buildup of their armies, it really made them go broke, and that's basically why the USSR imploded. Why isn't there a way for us to make a deal with Russia that would, in fact, bring down the level? Because I agree, I mean, there's way too many nuclear weapons in the world, and as they become more and more sophisticated, I mean, 70 to 80 million people killed would be a rounding error if we ever got into a nuclear war with Russia. Why isn't there an ability to bring down those numbers? Mr. Johnson, you're an expert in this.
So I think there is interest, at least on the part of some, in continuing reductions. And the first step, again, has been said here many times, is renewing that New START treaty, which at least keeps that current limit of 1,500 deployed. And then I think you would have to move on to a next round. One of the concerns that I have is that seems to be a lack of any sort of discussions in this strategic stability space, not just in reducing the numbers in the nuclear arsenals, but also in terms of concerns about avoiding accidents. We don't want to blunder ourselves into a nuclear war. And in some of the areas where have been mentioned in terms of cyber or AI.
Or aging, right? Some of these systems are just very old.
Sure, exactly. And so I think that there's a concern if you start to lose these basic elements of the arms control regime, it makes what you're talking about in terms of reductions even harder. The good news is, if there is any good news, is that while the Russian side has announced, I think 5 new systems that they want to deploy, at least 2 of them they've clarified would actually be countable under the New START treaty, which means that they would be limited even upon their deployment, so to sort of built in, which is one reason to extend that. So I would say you have to begin with that and begin to
My
have
time is almost over.
Sorry.
Is anyone optimistic that the numbers will go down dramatically? Mr. Vedemaker?
I would just say quickly, Russia's in a really bad security environment. I mean, they border China, they border the Islamic world, they see NATO as a threat, they feel surrounded. I think there's precious little interest in Russia in reducing their nuclear weapons. I had Russian officials tell me 15 years ago that their tactical nuclear weapons were more important to them at that point than they'd ever been before. If you're weak economically, or your population is declining, and you're surrounded by threats, you don't have a very good conventional military solution to your problem, and nuclear weapons are what you have to fall back on. So the Obama administration tried. I mean, they wanted to drop to 1,000 strategic nuclear weapons. The Russian answer was basically they weren't interested.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. The gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Picking up on Mr. Raymaker, tactical nuclear weapons scare me particularly because if there's an all-out nuclear war, it will be through escalation, and tactical nuclear weapons allow that escalation to proceed on a even slope rather than a sharp line between conventional and nuclear. This is not just the 50th anniversary of the NPT, it's the 75th anniversary of the year nuclear weapons were first used. Certainly, if we were having this meeting in 1946, we would have projected far more than 10 nuclear states or 8 nuclear states in the year 2020. Humankind has restrained itself more on this weapon system than any other weapon system, certainly. The international limits on the use of poison gas come close to being as effective. The United States has been particularly uncharitable to those who enter into nuclear limitation agreements with the United States. Gaddafi's dead. He gave up his nuclear program. Turned out he was more advanced than we thought he was. A few years later, we killed him. Oh, no, we bombed him to the point where somebody else killed him. We killed him. Saddam Hussein gave up his nuclear program. He suspended illegally inspections. He then, at the eve of our invasion, announced he would allow those inspections instead of doing the inspections. We killed him. And then we enter the JCPOA, and we pull out of that. So I'll just be a rhetorical question. Do we have the capacity to enter into agreements designed to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons or roll back North Korean weapons when it seems that once you, in the words of a country song, once you get at the top of Uncle Sam's list, nothing's going to cause us not to go after you. I want to put in a pitch with my colleagues for a couple of bills. I want to commend Mr. Bera, and I know Mr. Yoho was here. We have a resolution, HRES 825, to commemorate the Non-Proliferation Treaty at age 50. It reaffirms our support for the NPT, and I would hope that everyone here would like to co-sponsor that. And I want to shift to Saudi Arabia, which has indicated a kind of a keep up with the Joneses approach. If Iran's going to do it, well, we'll do it too. The Saudis have said, well, we want the same deal as Iran has. Well, Iran has a nuclear program without a nuclear cooperation agreement with the United States, and has a world of sanctions. What Saudi Arabia wants is a nuclear program, perhaps without a 1, 2, 3 agreement with the United States, and a loving embrace from Washington. Secretary Perry sent the Saudis a letter saying that we're committed to the gold standard in a 1, 2, 3 agreement with Saudi Arabia, no enrichment, no reprocessing. As long as I'm seeking co-sponsors, I want to urge people to co-sponsor the Saudi Nuclear Non-Proliferation Act, which demands where Congress says that you cannot get automatic approval for a 1, 2, 3 agreement with Saudis unless it meets that standard. Can we get Saudi Arabia to adhere to to enter an agreement with the gold standard as the Emirates have? Mr. Johnson.
Congressman, as you've pointed out, it's been very difficult to get the Saudis to agree to this, and they see this as giving up some sort of a sovereign right, though, as you would probably note yourself, there's no right to enrichment, of course, in the NPT. My short comment would be to say that if you cannot get the Saudis to agree to this so-called UAE standard, then your point is actually well taken. That if they want to take the Iran approach, well, the Iran approach was one of extremely limited amounts of enrichment, one of extremely intrusive monitoring and verification, more than exists in the normal IAEA case, and by the way, no provision of actual enrichment technology. So,
and I would add extreme hostility from the United States.
Point taken.
Thank you. I'll just comment that if there's a government that you can't trust with a bone saw, you shouldn't trust them with nuclear weapons. I yield back.
Thank you. And with that, I want to thank the witnesses and all the members for being here today. With that, the committee is adjourned.